In the flickering light of a Neolithic hut, a family sleeps on a packed earth floor. Beneath them, just inches down, lie the bones of their ancestors. This was not a burial of convenience. It was a choice. A choice that reveals how the first humans understood life, death, and the meaning of. Archaeologists call this practice house burial. It was common in the Neolithic period, from around 10,000 to 4,000 BCE, across many parts of the world. In the ancient settlement of Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey, excavators have found dozens of skeletons buried beneath the floors of homes. The dead were placed in shallow pits, often curled up on their sides as if sleeping. Why bury the dead under your home? One theory is that it kept the ancestors close. In a world without written records, the dead were the memory of the community. Their bones under the floor were a constant reminder of lineage, of who belonged to this house. It may also have been a way to claim ownership of the land. By burying your ancestors in the floor, you were saying, "This place is ours." House burial eventually declined as societies grew larger and cemeteries appeared. But the practice left a deep mark on human psychology. It shows that for thousands of years, the line between the living and the dead was not a wall. It was a floor. And that floor was the found carefully arranged. Some were curled on their sides, knees drawn to the chest as if sleeping. Others were placed with grave goods, a necklace of shells, a polished stone axe, a bowl of seeds. The position and offerings suggest a belief in an afterlife, a journey the dead would need provisions for. But why under the house? One compelling theory is that these burials strengthen the family's claim to the land. By keeping ancestors physically inside the home, the living could assert a deep, unbroken connection to that specific plot of earth. In a world without written deeds, the bones of your grandfather were your title to the soil. The house became a shrine, and the dead became permanent guardians of the family's legacy. But there may have been a more intimate reason. In these early farming communities, the line between the living and the dead was not a hard boundary. The dead were still part of the household. They were consulted, remembered, and fed. Some skulls were removed, plastered, and painted, kept in the main room as revered ancestors. Burying a loved one under the floor kept them close, a silent presence in daily life. This practice eventually faded as societies grew larger and more complex. Cemeteries appeared outside settlements, and the dead were moved away from the living. But for thousands of years, in the first villages of the Neolithic, home was where the heart was, and where the ancestors rested. The floor beneath your feet held not just packed earth, but the memory of those who came before. Carefully positioned, often with grave goods like beads, tools, or shells. The dead were not discarded, they were kept close. This was not a universal custom. At other sites like Jericho, some burials were inside houses while others were in communal areas. But the pattern is clear. For many early communities, the boundary between the living and the dead was porous. The dead were part of the community, still present, still watching. This intimate relationship with death would persist for thousands of years, long after the first farmers settled down and built the first cities. But as villages grew into towns and towns into cities, something began to shift. The dead were gradually moved out of the home and into designated areas, the first formal cemetery. Çatalhöyük in modern-day Turkey was one such early town. At its peak, around 7,000 BCE, it housed up to 8,000 people. Houses were packed together like a honeycomb with no streets, people walked across the rooftops. And beneath the floors of those houses, the dead were buried. Over time, the population grew and the dead accumulated. Eventually, the living had to make a choice. Keep the ancestors underfoot or find a new place. That choice marks a turning point in human history. The first dedicated cemeteries appear in the archaeological record around 10,000 BCE in the Natufian culture of the Levant. But it was in the Neolithic period, as farming spread, that burial grounds became common. The dead were no longer under the hearth. They were given their own place, outside the village, beyond the walls. A separation. The living and the dead was porous. Imagine waking up every morning knowing that your grandmother, your father, your child, lay beneath the floor where you ate and slept. For the people of Çatalhöyük, this was not morbid. It was a source of comfort and identity. The dead were living, offering guidance and protection. This practice of burying the dead within the home was not unique to Çatalhöyük. It was a widespread tradition in the Neolithic Near East, reflecting a worldview where ancestors remained active members of the household. But the relationship with the dead went even deeper. In some houses, skulls were removed from bodies and plastered, with features carefully modeled to recreate the face of the deceased. These plastered skulls were kept in the home, perhaps displayed on a platform or niche, serving as tangible links to ancestors. These practices reveal a profound truth about Neolithic life. Death was not an end, but a transformation. The dead continued to participate in the world of the living, their presence shaping daily life, rituals, and the very architecture of the home. In Çatalhöyük, the boundary between life and death was not a wall, but a doorway. Living to bless the crops and to ensure the family's continuity. Some skeletons show signs of being reopened after burial. Skulls were removed, painted, and reburied. This suggests ongoing interaction with the dead. They were not forgotten ancestors, they were active members of the household. Archaeological evidence reveals remarkable details. At Çatalhöyük, over 400 skeletons have been found buried beneath the floors of houses. Many of these burials contain multiple individuals, suggesting that families were buried together over generations. The bodies were often placed in a fetal position, with knees drawn up to the chest. This posture mirrors the position of a newborn, suggesting a symbolic rebirth. The dead were not simply disposed of, they were carefully arranged, as if being prepared for. Grave goods were also common. People were buried with jewelry, tools, and even food. These items were meant to accompany the dead into the afterlife, but not everyone received the same treatment. Some burials are rich with offerings, while others contain nothing at all. Have been found under house floors, men, women, children, all ages. Many show signs of healed injuries, suggesting they were cared for in life. Some graves contain multiple individuals layered over generations. This was a family vault. The positioning is consistent. Bodies were placed in a flexed fetal position, often on their left side, with their heads pointing south. Grave goods are rare, but when present they are personal items. A spindle whorl, a knife, a pot, nothing warlike. These are not warriors buried with weapons. They are farmers, herders, and families who lived and died in the same. This burial tradition lasted for over 1,000 years, from the Neolithic to the Iron Age. The consistency is remarkable. Across hundreds of sites in Anatolia and the Levant, the same pattern appears. Bodies under the floor, flexed on the left side, head to the south. It was a deliberate, shared culture. But why? Why bury the dead under the floor? The most likely explanation is that the living wanted to keep their ancestors close. The dead were not feared or banished. They remained part of the household. They were protectors, guardians of the family. To live above your ancestors was to be constantly reminded of where you came from. Facing the wall, this may reflect beliefs about rebirth or a journey to an afterlife. Chemical analysis of teeth and bones shows that those buried together ate similar foods. They were biological relatives. The house was not just a shelter, it was a lineage made visible. This practice was not limited to Anatolia. At Jericho, similar burials have been found beneath homes, with skulls often removed and plastered to create ancestor portraits. These plastered skulls were kept in the house, perhaps to maintain the presence of the dead among the living. The house became a permanent home for both the living and the dead. This tradition of burying ancestors under the floor continued for thousands of years, shaping the earliest ideas of home, family, and memory. In the Levant, skulls were removed and plastered with clay to create lifelike portraits, some of the earliest known human representations. In the Nile Valley, early pre-dynastic Egyptians buried their dead in simple pits near or under homes. In the Indus Valley, at sites like Mehrgarh, burials were found within residential areas. In Neolithic communities, burying the dead close to the living kept ancestors present in daily life, reinforcing social bonds and memory. China at Jericho, some graves were inside house floors. Each culture adapted the idea to its own beliefs, but the core was the same: the dead belonged with the living. Burying the dead under the house had profound social consequences. It tied a family to a specific location. The ancestors were literally embedded in the home. Creating a permanent bond between the living family and the land. This practice reinforced property rights and lineage. The dead were no longer just memories. They were physical anchors that kept families rooted in one place for generations. The land, creating a claim that lasted for generations. This may have been one of the earliest forms of property rights. If your ancestors were buried under the floor, that house was yours. not just by occupation, but by blood. Some researchers argue that this practice helped stabilize early agricultural societies, preventing conflict over land and resources. But this system had a dark side. As populations grew, so did the need for more land. Communities that had once coexisted peacefully began to clash. The same burial practices that once united families now became a justification for exclusion and violence. Strangers were no longer welcome. This shift from cooperation to competition marked a turning point in human history. The very rituals that had once bound communities together now drove them apart. Land became a source of power, and those without ancestral ties to it were pushed to the margins. The seeds of territorial warfare were sown. And yet, even as conflict arose, new forms of cooperation also emerged. Trade networks expanded, linking distant communities. Ideas and technologies spread faster than ever. The same pressures that led to war also spurred innovation. It was a paradox. The very forces that divided humanity also put land, the dead became the ultimate deed. Then something changed. Around 4000 to 3000 BCE in many regions, the dead began to move out of the house. Separate cemeteries appeared, sometimes just outside the village, sometimes further away. Why? One theory points to the rise of larger, more complex societies, as villages grew into towns. Land ownership became more defined. Families began to claim specific plots for farming and living. By burying their dead in a fixed cemetery, they were also marking their territory. The ancestors became a permanent claim on the land. A family that had been there for generations had a stronger right to the soil than newcomers. This idea of ancestral land rights might explain why some of the most impressive ancient monuments are tombs. Think of the Great Pyramids of Egypt, the megalithic tombs of Europe, or the royal burial mounds of Asia. These weren't just resting places for the dead. They were statements of power, ownership, and permanence carved into the landscape. But not everyone agreed with this new order. Some groups resisted the idea of permanent settlements and private property. They continued their old ways, mobile, communal, with the dead staying close, but not tied to a single plot of land. This tension between the settled and the mobile would the intimate bond between one family and one plot of land weakened. New religious ideas may have emphasized a distinct realm of the dead. Practical concerns, hygiene, space, social hierarchy also played a role. The dead were no longer under the floor, they were given their own place. But the memory of that ancient intimacy lingered. Families still visited, left flowers, whispered names. The dead were no longer under the floor, they were given their own place. But the memory of that ancient intimacy remained, a quiet thread through the centuries, never fully disappeared. We no longer bury our dead under the floor, but we still keep them close, in photographs, in heirlooms, in stories told around the table. The ancient impulse to keep the dead near us, to make them part of our home, is still alive. It reminds us that a home is never just a building, it is a vessel for memory. Just a building, it is a vessel for memory. Every wall holds echoes of laughter, every corner whispers secrets of the past. The dead may be gone, but their presence lingers in the spaces they once filled. We decorate our homes with their favorite colors, keep their books on our shelves, and tell their stories to our children. In this way, the dead become ancestors, not forgotten, but transformed into guides and guardians of the family. The home becomes a bridge between generations, a place where the past and present coexist. And perhaps that is the deepest purpose of a home, to hold the invisible threads that connect us to those who came before. The home is not just where we live, it is where we remember. And in remembering, we keep the dead alive. The floorboards may no longer hide graves, but the house itself has become a kind of tomb, a living tomb filled with the warmth of memory. And that, perhaps, is the most human thing of all. Just a structure, it is a vessel for memory, a place where the past and present coexist. The first humans who buried their ancestors under their floors understood something we are only beginning to rediscover, that the dead are not gone. They are part of the foundation. So the next time you stand in an old building, remember that every floor has been walked on by generations before you. Each footprint is a story. Each wall has heard whispers, laughter, and tears. The house remembers. And perhaps, if we listen closely, we can hear its stories too. On the floor of your home, consider what lies beneath. Not literally, perhaps, but in the sense of all the lives that came before. The first humans who buried their dead under their houses were not strange or primitive. They were us trying to hold on to those they loved, and in that they succeeded. In the ancient city of Jericho, around 8000 BC, archaeologists found skulls that had been separated from bodies, then covered with plaster and painted to recreate the features of the dead. These were not trophies. They were portraits, the oldest known attempts to preserve a specific person's face for the living to remember. These plastered skulls were kept in the homes of the living, often displayed on shelves or in special alcoves. The dead remained part of the household. They were consulted, honored, and remembered. The boundary between the living and the dead was not a wall, but this practice lasted for centuries across the Levant. It shows us that the need to remember to keep the dead close is as old as civilization itself. We build houses, but we also build memories. And sometimes we build them in the same place.